Now, let's bring in the panel. And it's Macquarie Media All-Star panel tonight for the first time from 2GB reporter, producer extraordinaire, he's so much more. James Willis, good evening and welcome.
Yeah, good evening to you, Jane. Great to be here. I'm a big fan of your work and really keen to get stuck into some of these big issues. You mentioned the drought off the top. That has been dominating talkback radio for the last couple of months, and some of the stories you hear from people on the land that are walking off, that are months away from running out of water and supplies and everything else, is heartbreaking. And you get the feeling at the moment that the people in Canberra keep trying to announce policies around it, but just aren't getting through, and the people in the bush feel totally abandoned.
Absolutely, James. And of course, you're a part of the Alan Jones show, and Alan Jones has brought this issue front and centre, both here on Sky News and on radio. The rest of us are just bringing up the rear. Welcome back to the front page. Also, Macquarie radio broadcaster extraordinaire Clinton Maynard. Great to have you back, Clinton.
Good evening, Jane. Great to be here. Looking forward to talking on the program a little later with you about the issue you spoke about on radio earlier this evening, the $10,000 cash ban. I think we may clash on that one, Jane.
Oh, might we just? All right. Well, James, Clinton, are we in for a Barney? Let's take a look. Let's take a look at the front page of the Australian tomorrow. And the big story there is let surplus go, Keating urges PM. Troy Brampston has this story tomorrow, and he says that Paul Keating has urged the Morrison government to loosen fiscal policy to stimulate the economy through an ambitious productivity-enhancing infrastructure investment program and turbocharging vocational education and training. There's a lot of information in here, but he talks about, he says, we're moving into a big world, big government, with world growth shrinking, monetary policy being incapable of providing stimulus. He says the building of infrastructure, both by governments and private industry, perhaps acting in concert, is the way forward. He also says, and if you've been listening to Alan Jones, you'll know this inside out and upside down, because he's also spoken to the Herald Sun's Terry McCrann about this, the cost of borrowing is at such low levels, a bold new infrastructure program that would stimulate the economy was needed. Clinton, I'll go to you on this. I mean, Alan Jones has been really interesting talking about the water infrastructure that he was calling for 20 years ago. He was talking about Libya and the like. When you listen to what Paul Keating, or read what Paul Keating's got to say tomorrow, I feel like some of that folds into the very arguments that are being made about future-proofing. What are your thoughts on what Keating's got to say tomorrow?
It's rare that I agree with a former Labor Prime Minister, to be honest, but look, Keating has a very good record, a track record when it comes to economic reform. Firstly, the point on monetary policy is stimulus. He is spot on there. Cutting interest rates doesn't work anymore to get the economy moving. If you just look at your own personal circumstances, I'm just like most Sydney-siders aged in their 40s. I've got a big Sydney mortgage. I've got 3 kids. Now, since interest rates started to come down, back in 2008, remember they started to come down with the GFC, I've not cut my own repayments. So the idea that the Reserve Bank cuts your interest rates so you pump more money into the economy by spending, well, it doesn't always work, because most of us, certainly with big mortgages, we use that opportunity to pay more off the mortgage. And there's evidence, plenty of research has been done in recent years, that's exactly what's been happening. I know in my case it has been. But when it comes to infrastructure, he is right to a point that the government needs to do more when it comes to visionary projects. But I've been arguing this point on 2GB and 4BC in recent weeks, Jane. We don't have politicians with any vision when it comes to big spending infrastructure. So, for instance, yes, Alan's been making those excellent points for 20 years about dams, but there are so many other infrastructure projects that politicians ignore because of the 3-year political cycle. So, high-speed rail, for instance. We've been talking about high-speed rail between Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne for about 40 years, since I was born, but we haven't seen any progress of it. We all know our cities are overcrowded, for instance. That causes problems. If we had high-speed rail between, say, Sydney and Goulburn, to the south of Sydney, you could have people living in Goulburn and working in Sydney. But the problem is we don't have governments with long-term vision, because they're all worried about the next election in 3 years' time. And then they're worried about, oh, we've got to have a surplus because we'll attract bad headlines if we have a deficit. But it's a balance. And clearly what's happening at the moment isn't working when it comes to stimulus.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree with you more. And I know that the coalition went to the election and one of the big promises was the surplus. But I think I think, and James, you're manning the phones there. You're seeing what I'm seeing every night, even if we try not to start our talkback topics on drought, the issues of the day. It's just, we're just getting, if you'll pardon the pun, floods of callers, and it goes back to a lack of planning, a lack of infrastructure. Clinton's right talking about the quick election cycle. I mean, there is enormous will in the community, as I said off the top, in the cities, for something to be done for people in the bush. Alan Jones has made talked about Libya. So Paul Keating saying tomorrow, James, to look at infrastructure and borrow cheap money. That certainly, I think, will have some cachet with the talkback audience. What are your thoughts on just that general argument?
Yeah, I think when Labor was in power, we heard about the debt and we heard about how many budgets we had lost and they were overspending and everything else. And when Scott Morrison was part of the election, there was this obsession with getting back into the black, and we spoke about that over and over again. Josh Frydenberg has spoken about it over and over again. And what Clinton has said is right. Now, there's no reason why we can't be talking about high-speed rail, and I've just come back from Japan where the entire country has been on bullet train network for more than 50 years, and it allows you to live in cheaper areas, maybe 3 hours out of town by car, but it's only 60 minutes by train, and that way you can live cheaper, live in a rural town and still commute in by high-speed rail every day. We should have done that and have been speaking about that 20 years ago, but for some reason, something that big is not on the agenda. Now, the other thing we should be talking about a little bit more is coal-fired power, and for some reason, governments aren't even keen to discuss the idea of building new coal-fired power plants. They're shutting down. We know that's the most reliable source of energy still, but for some reason, governments don't want to go near that issue, even though for most people, if they want cheap energy, that's just a no-brainer with voters.
They're worried about those big projects, Jane and James, because they're thinking what happens in 3 years' time. We need to go to an election. And those big projects take longer than 3 years. But what they do get concerned about is the headline about the debt and deficit. And I think,
right.
I think
and
politicians...
they won't be the ribbon cutters.
Well,
they won't be the ribbon cutters,
correct.
Clinton. That's the thing.
It may be the other side of politics.
It'll all be... Well, you guys saw in Sydney all of the disruption, putting the trams through, all of the disruption, all of the pain that hurt. Imagine if Gladys Berejiklian hadn't held on at that election. Imagine if it was someone from Labor doing that ribbon cutting. Let's move on and look at this ISIS brides story, because I'll be really interested to get your take on this, guys. It says ISIS brides volunteer for control orders on return. There's a lot of pressure mounting for the return of these ISIS brides. I, for one, do not want to see our service personnel going in and risking life and limb. But it says the wives of Islamic State fighters being held in Syria have made an extraordinary offer to the government, volunteering to be placed under the most onerous conditions of Australia's control order regime if repatriated. I mean, it wouldn't be anything as onerous as the living conditions under which they are existing now, would it, James?
No, and are we really expecting, and you have sympathy for these people, but at the same time, are we going to risk the entire security and community to try and get a few people back that have made their way to these areas one way or another? And I just don't think this is worth the risk, both for our servicemen, as you say, but also these people may have witnessed atrocities. We don't know what sort of training or practices they may have been involved in previously. I know it's harsh, but at the end of the day, we've got to be looking after our own people first and making sure the community's looked after. We had these issues recently where a family wanted to come back of a terrorist that had been overseas, and you have to ask yourself what kind of living conditions, what training these people have been involved in. And with that in mind, I don't think any of this is worth the risk. And I think you'd find if you ask most Australians, they would be on that same path.
Yeah, they would. I understand the argument about children, but all the experts say there's an enormous amount of resources that need to go into helping those children.